Devourer. Chapter 258, Change of Plans. So, what do you guys do every day? I asked, swimming alongside the dark Naga. We were heading toward the corpse. It was visible even from here, a vast shape resting on the seafloor, but distance underwater is deceptive. It looked close. It was not. I could reach it in moments if I wanted to, but the dark Naga were slow, deliberate creatures, and I had no intention of outpacing them. The last thing I needed was to spook them into hostility. Not that it would matter much if they did. I could handle them easily. I could, if I were being honest, take them apart and eat them without much effort. Still, there was little point. Having another race quietly subservient was far more useful than a brief meal. On a more collector-minded note, I already had the Naga. Acquiring the dark Naga would neatly complete the set, so to speak. That thought led, as it often did, to a stranger one. I wondered briefly if heaven had its own version. Light Naga, perhaps. Gleaming scales, halos, immaculate fins. Probably not. Heaven ran on faith and racism. I doubted the angels would tolerate anything remotely serpentine, slithering through their polished, perfect realm. "We guard," the dark Naga captain replied. "Cool, sounds fun," I said as we continued forward. Not much of a conversationalist. I had a feeling that applied to the rest of them as well. The silence stretched, filled only by the slow rhythm of scales cutting through water. "So," I tried again, "is the corpse rotting?" The dark Naga paused mid-stroke, just for a moment. "Not anymore," he replied. "Anymore?" I echoed, turning my head to look at the dark Naga swimming beside me. "Unclear," the Naga said. "Uh-huh," I said, facing forward again. The corpse was much closer now. Its vast shape glowed faintly in the deep, an unhealthy, almost deliberate light radiating from something that should have been nothing more than a pile of bones. As we neared it, the dark Naga slowed, then stopped around me. I drifted for a moment before turning, the question clear on my face, even if I did not bother to ask it out loud. "We cannot approach. Ether levels too high," the Naga said. "Right. Wait here, I guess." I turned and shot forward, leaving them behind. The water peeled away as I closed the remaining distance, and soon I was close enough to finally get a proper look. This thing was ugly. Nearly 100 meters long, the corpse stretched across the seafloor, its body serpentine and coiled. 4 massive legs protruded from its underside, with 2 additional arms set higher along the torso, their placement uneven and unnatural. Webbed wings lay folded and tattered along its back, far too large for a creature that already seemed overbuilt. The head was elongated and serpentine, the skull drawn out into a predatory shape. Along the sides were long oval eye sockets stretched horizontally rather than set forward. Above them, a bulbous dome-like forehead swelled outward, smooth and rounded, distorting the skull's proportions and giving it an oddly top-heavy silhouette. Those eyes were strange. You could not fit actual eyeballs into sockets shaped like that. The bulb at the top, though, made sense. A sensor dome. The adaptation clearly worked well, if even this thing retained it. That only raised another question. If the dome handled sensing, why keep the eyes at all? As for the body, it was harder to draw conclusions. Among the firstborn, physical form was flexible. Bodies could be altered at will. The serpentine structure might simply be a temporary configuration optimized for deep water, or it could be more permanent. There was no easy way to tell. As I drifted closer, I noticed something that made my mood lift immediately. The corpse was regenerating. Not quickly, not dramatically, but enough to be unmistakable, fine tissue knitting itself back together in slow, stubborn increments. Those winged assholes in heaven had not managed to fully kill this one. Given a few more 1,000 years, the angels might have received a rather unpleasant surprise. That was, of course, assuming I had not come along first. It also explained the fog spreading above ground. I had initially assumed it was a byproduct of decomposition, but it was not decay at all. The body was healing, and in the process, it was bleeding ambient ether into the surrounding world. From what I could see, there were 2 hearts in there. Not bad. I swam into the ribcage, slipping easily through the gaps between the massive bones. This thing was big. Still big. alive in a manner of speaking, but not for long. Now then, let's eat, shall we? I drifted toward the nearest heart and began to reshape my body, expanding until I was large enough to consume it in a few solid bites. Just looking at it made saliva pool in my mouth. I had not had a meal like this in years. Oh, this was going to be so fucking good. I took a bite and the reaction was immediate. Flavor flooded my senses, an absurd, overwhelming sweetness that hit like a shock. It was rich and dense, layered with something deeper beneath it, a taste that felt ancient and powerful. My hunger surged in response, drowning out everything else. I bit again and again. Each tear of flesh released more warmth, more ether, the heart pulsing weakly even as I devoured it. I clung to the organ, ripping into it with careless force, reveling in the sheer indulgence of it. This was not food meant to be eaten politely. This was sustenance on a scale I had not tasted in years. Thought unraveled, logic slipped away piece by piece, washed out by instinct. All that remained was hunger, raw and demanding. I wanted more, needed more. The need was total, eclipsing reason, purpose, until there was nothing but the act of feeding and the certainty that stopping was not an option. The first heart collapsed in on itself beneath my grip, its glow dimming as the last of its strength was torn away and swallowed. I barely registered it. The moment it was gone, the absence hit harder than the meal itself, a hollow ache that demanded to be filled immediately. I turned and surged deeper into the ribcage, water churning around me as I locked onto the second heart. It beat stronger, faster, as if it somehow sensed what had just happened. That only made it better. I did not slow down. I slammed into it, claws and teeth tearing through connective tissue as I pulled it free enough to bite. Flavor exploded again, familiar and intoxicating, and whatever restraint I might have had left evaporated. I tore into it greedily, ripping chunks away, devouring them almost without chewing. The creature shuddered around me, vast muscles spasming in slow, useless waves, but it barely registered. All that mattered was the taste, the warmth, the surge of power flooding back into me with every bite. I fed until the heart was little more than shredded ruin, until the glow faded and the beating finally stuttered and stopped. Only then did the hunger begin to loosen its grip. Then, of course, the voice reappeared. Acquired new Devourer strain. Harrow strain acquired. Warning strain incomplete. Analyzing. Harrow strain assimilated. Gestalt domination upgraded. Gestalt ascension acquired. Deep One Arcana acquired. Hunger of the Undying upgraded. Will of the Undying acquired. Psionic Transcendence 8 upgraded. Psionic Transcendence 10 acquired. Harrow Fangs acquired. Combining Harrow Fangs with Kaiser Blades. Mortem Blades acquired. Mortem Spines acquired. Death Fog Affinity acquired. Death Fog Mastery acquired. Death Fog Aura acquired. Death Fog Breathe acquired. Commander of the Dead acquired. Necromantic Ascension acquired. Calibrating. Void Enchant. Harrowed Enchant acquired. Harrowed Enchant available for Mortem Spines and Mortem Blades. Kills will now cause corpses to reanimate as undead upon kill. No core evolution progress achieved. Current Devourer strains: Wraith, Eternal Mother, Harrow. Note: ambient ether absorption is now significantly increased. It is viable to decontaminate Vulpus Maxima and other contaminated regions. Well, I will be damned. That actually made things easier. I might not need to drag the Vulpus across the mountains after all. In theory, I could simply absorb all the ether fog myself and stabilize the region. Problem solved. Then again, if I did that, the angels would notice. An ether-irradiated hellscape does not just fix itself. Questions would follow, and none of them would be comfortable. I could not keep it secret either. One or two Vulpus would talk eventually, and absorbing that much ether, especially ether leaking from a dead firstborn, is not something just anyone can do. Only another firstborn could manage it, which meant open war, and I was not ready for that yet. Still, evacuating the Vulpus, only to reveal later that I could have fixed everything all along, would look bad. Betrayal bad. Cultural extinction bad. The kind of bad that comes back to bite you centuries later. Unless I framed it as something I gained later. A new evolution, a reward from defeating heaven, some special magic, or access to their absurdly fancy power source. I could sell it as progress, as growth. Hey, look at that, I can repair your homeland now. Not before. Definitely not before. Totally impossible back then. Not that I was pretending, and not that I uprooted your entire culture when I technically did not have to. Certainly not because the angels would have tried to kill me. Yes, that sounds reasonable enough. Yeah, let's go with that. Let's go with that, Audius replied dryly, his gaze settling on the trembling messenger. In another age, a bearer of news like this would have lost his head before finishing the report. Constraint, however, had a way of teaching restraint. This messenger belonged to the Empress, not to him. That distinction mattered now, unlike the days when he had been a vampire lord. He looked down at the message again. The naval invasion and the pincer were frozen. Do not press the attack. Hold the elves in containment at the river. Audius did not think the order was foolish, even if it was infuriating. The invasion was already prepared. Ships stood ready, plans finalized, the entire line along the river poised to exploit the opening, and now he was being told to hold position. This reeked of grand strategy. Something had changed, and whatever that change was, it had forced a significant pivot in plans, and this definitely came from the great beast. The phrasing alone gave it away. That cadence, that irritating, infuriating irreverence, worn so casually by someone powerful enough to earn it. No one else would dare write like this to him. For instance, the letter began with, Yo, Audius. Yo, Audius had killed for lesser transgressions. But that raised an obvious question. The great beast did not write. He never bothered with letters. He usually appeared in person, hijacked some unfortunate hive creature with a mouth not designed for speech, and garbled out his instructions directly. Efficient, crude, personal. A letter meant something had changed. He was busy with something else, something important enough not to show up himself. Or he was simply fucking with Audius. That was always a possibility. With the great beast, there was no reliable way to tell. Auridas pinched the bridge of his nose as he tried to get his blood pressure under control. My lord, one of his adjutants asked. Have it done. Holding pattern. No offensive operations until we receive imperial authorization. Audius said, eyes still closed, fingers pressed firmly against the bridge of his nose. Every instinct in him screamed against the order. Centuries of war had taught him to press when the enemy faltered, to turn hesitation into annihilation. The river line was ready, the elves were contained. One command would have shattered them. Instead, he exhaled slowly and let the moment pass. Authority mattered, timing mattered more. Whatever game the great beast was playing, Audius was being forced to wait his turn, and that, more than anything else, set his fangs on edge. On a certain level, Audius knew this was not stupidity. As much as he chafed against the great beast, he did not doubt its intelligence. Victory won without unnecessary losses was still victory, and full assaults through the elven forests were ruinously expensive in both men and material. Worse, every elf slain was a potential subject lost. A cleaner conquest carried another advantage. Fewer bodies meant fewer grievances. Reduced devastation left less fertile ground for rebellion later. All Audius had to do was sit still and bleed the elves from across the river. They could not meaningfully strike back. If they broke first, it was a free victory. That outcome was unlikely, but within this framework, he could not lose. The Empire's coffers were deep enough to sustain the stalemate for years, and Audius doubted it would even take that long. If whatever scheme the great beast was pursuing failed, the Empress would simply order the assault renewed. If it succeeded, the assault would be unnecessary. Either way, the logical move was to wait. But the one thing that truly grated on him was this. The great beast had not bothered to explain what the play was on his end. No context, no outline. Just an order to wait and trust that something elsewhere justified the pause. So Audius remained here, mired in an uncomfortable forest, ordering his men to loose volleys into trees across a river. Leaves shattered, bark splintered, elves vanished deeper into cover. It was effective, technically. It was also faintly humiliating. Strategically sound or not, it was hard to feel like a conquering general while waging war against foliage. Still, Audias was nothing if not pragmatic. A temporary humiliation in exchange for the elven homeland was a bargain he could tolerate quite easily, especially with a cup of blood in hand. Audius glanced down at the map, his eyes lingering on the infuriatingly frozen front line, then shifted his gaze back to the messenger. "You may return to the capital post-haste," he said evenly, "and inform the Empress that her message has been received." The messenger hesitated, fidgeting in place. "Sir, I am from the front line. A hive creature told me to write that down exactly as it was said." Audius paused. Slowly he looked up. "You are one of my soldiers," he said, voice flat, "and a hive creature instructed you to write this message, deliver it to me, and say it was from the great beast." "Yes, sir." Audius pinched the bridge of his nose again and closed his eyes. So the great beast was not busy after all, he was simply fucking with him. Audius exhaled, opened his eyes, and looked at the messenger once more. "Very well, return to your post." The soldier turned to leave. "And soldier," Audius added without looking up, "kindly mention where you got the message next time." Chapter 259. The Art of the Deal. Minive stormed into the command tent, eyes ablaze with raw fury. What the hell was this? The plans were finalized, the ships were ready. Her kin had fought and died to stall for this very moment, and now she was being told the pincer was cancelled. Audius looked up, red vampiric eyes meeting hers with the infuriating calm of someone who had fully expected this confrontation. "Yes?" he asked mildly as he set his pen down. It was an ornate thing, carved from wyvern bone with an enchanted mithril tip. A grotesque luxury, a pen capable of signing away lives with a scratch of ink. "Why has the landing been paused?" Minive demanded. "Has the Empire lost its nerve?" "Careful," Audius replied evenly. "Accusing us of cowardice is not a road you want to walk." "Then why?" she shot back. "My kin bled to hold your line and—" "As did my men," Audius cut in. His voice remained calm, but it carried weight now. "And as much as you like to believe I am a bloodthirsty monster who does not care for those under my command, you are mistaken." He leaned back slightly. "I am a vampire. I drink blood. Yes, I am a monster. But I am not incompetent. The Empress gives me men and material. If I squander them, I am the one who answers very difficult questions." "So why?" Minive pressed. "Because I received orders," Audius said flatly. "An abstract concept, I know, but unlike your band of rebels, the Imperial Army obeys the chain of command." The situation changed. He stood and dismissed his officers with a flick of his hand. The tent emptied quickly, leaving only the two of them. "What situation?" Minive asked, circling the table. "I do not know," Audius snapped. The irritation was brief, but it was enough. That crack in his composure oddly eased Minive's fury. "You don't know?" she asked, quieter now. "No," Audius said sharply. "The order came from the great beast, and given that you have spoken to him before, I assume you understand exactly why that is all I can tell you." Minive paused, memories surfacing. Her encounters with the great beast had been few, but each had carried the unmistakable sensation of being poked by a god for its own amusement. "So," she sighed, "he gave you a riddle." "If it were a riddle, I could at least work with it," Audius replied as he sat back down. "No, he simply told me to halt the landing and hold position." "How long?" Minive asked. "I do not know, but I suspect he has found something that tips the scales in our favor." Audius glanced down at the map, tapping the river with one finger. "He is many things, none of them undeserved, but a fool he is not." He looked back up at her. "As you have no doubt realized, river crossings are dangerous affairs. No matter how effective the pincer, the crossing itself would have bled us heavily. It was a cost we were prepared to pay." His voice hardened. "But if there is a path forward that spares our forces, I will take it." "So what do we do now?" Minive asked. "We keep shooting across the river," Audius replied with a tired sigh. "Stage a few fake crossing attempts, keep pressure on them, and try to prevent morale from collapsing in this bloody quagmire." Audius knew this was a problem. The pincer had already been announced to the soldiers, meant to prepare them for the river crossing. Half of it had been about hardening their resolve, giving fear a direction instead of letting it fester. The other half had been about showing them there was an end to this campaign, a point where the waiting would stop and the suffering would finally be spent. Now the front was frozen in amber. Audiers understood exactly how corrosive that was to morale. The men had already committed themselves mentally to the crossing. They had rehearsed it in their heads, braced their nerves, accepted the cost. Fear, once acknowledged, became manageable. It could be faced, endured, and survived. Probably. Waiting without purpose gnawed at soldiers far more effectively than combat ever could. Uncertainty crept in during the quiet hours. Why delay now? What had gone wrong? Had command lost confidence? Corrosive questions that bled discipline? Silence filled the gaps where answers should have been, and silence always bred rumors. Rumors bred fear, and fear without an outlet turned to the most dangerous thing of all, doubt. Armies did not break when ordered to advance. They broke when ordered to wait without knowing why. Left unattended, that kind of fear did not explode. It rotted, slowly, eating discipline, confidence, and cohesion from the inside long before the enemy ever had a chance to finish the job. So we just wait? No end in sight? Minuvai asked. Apparently so. The good news is we can use the hive to blunt most of the losses. I will disseminate information that something changed in the planning, orders from the great beast. Perhaps the wrath of an ancient will dissuade most foolish actors from dissenting too much, Audias said. Minuvai sighed and just turned away and walked out of the tent, saying one passing comment before she leaves. I hope you are right. O'Neill grumbled as he sat on his horse. This was stupid. The Vulpes were not yellow, and the Vulpina Rangers were tougher still. Where Montis got off telling him and the other officers that they needed to meet farther back just to avoid spooking the common troops was beyond him. It was not just insulting, it was a security risk. In theory, the Avalonian Empire could attempt a decapitation strike. The only reason anyone had agreed to this nonsense at all was that it was obvious the Imperials stood to gain nothing from it. Still, several officers had been left behind, just in case. The general himself was here, of course. O'Neill sometimes wondered, in private, whether the old fox half wanted someone to try to kill him, just to put an end to the slow misery of aging. Great beast, huh? Fancy name for some monster, O'Neill sneered. General Abel shot him a glare. Careful, you do not know how good that thing's hearing is. Pretty good, a nearby Imperial soldier said mildly, nodding toward the hive beast standing only a few meters away. Considering he can hear through that. Abel paused, then turned his glare back on O'Neill. O'Neill only snorted. If I'm useful, I'll live. Abel closed his eyes for a moment, drawing in a slow breath as if gathering the last scraps of patience he possessed. Would you kindly not gamble with all our lives, Captain? O'Neill grunted but held his tongue. Bravado only carried you so far, and most people with any sense knew better than to push it when ancients were involved. They lived too long, remembered too much, and wielded power that made ordinary grudges irrelevant. Patience, when it ran out, did not result in shouting or threats. It resulted in consequences that echoed for generations. Best not to test where that line was. Do not worry. The great beast has a sense of humor, the Imperial soldier said dryly, even if he is, quite frankly, terrifying. And you know this because? Abel asked, one brow lifting. The rumors are remarkably consistent, the soldier replied evenly. And besides, would you joke about something like this? Abel grunted, conceding the point. When people spoke of something that could erase you and everything you cared about, the stories usually turned reverent, fearful, or hysterical. They did not drift toward casual observations about personality. Calling an existential threat humorous was not normal unless it had shown restraint often enough for people to notice. It also helped that the stories matched. Different mouths, different places, same unsettling details. Consistency like that did not come from imagination alone. What are you thinking, old man? O'Neill drawled as he lit a cigarette. You've got that. I've got too much in my head expression again. Sometimes, Abel replied dryly. I wish you had a bit more in that empty head of yours, Captain. Nice jab, O'Neill said, blowing out a cloud of smoke. Should have seen that coming. Still, General, O'Neill said, his tone edging into something almost serious. Say we do get across the cliffs and mountains. How are we supposed to get the rest of these stubborn folk to move? We're alive by the gun, die by the gun type. Tell them they do not have to die, Captain, Abel replied bluntly, though even he did not sound convinced. Wish it were that easy, General, O'Neill said grimly. Me too, Captain, me too, Abel replied, his mouth twisting into a faint grimace. The two of them fell silent, eyes drifting out toward the desert stretching beyond the road. Dry, forsaken, a land that killed far more than it nurtured. The wind carried cruel hits instead of promise, and the earth gave nothing freely. The Vulpes had been shaped by this place, tempered by scarcity and hard survival. Endurance was not just a trait here, it was identity. You did not simply live in the desert. You proved, day after day, that it had failed to break you. And so the question the Vulpes now had to face was unavoidable. They were wastelanders. What were they without the wastes? O'Neill squinted at the sky as a large shape came into view, closing the distance far too quickly. You think he'll slow down? O'Neill asked mildly, taking another drag from his cigarette. How do you know it's a he? Abel grumbled. Doesn't seem like a relevant point of contention, General, O'Neill replied. Neither is asking if he'll slow down, Abel shot back. If he rams us, we're paced. Fair enough, O'Neill grunted. O'Neill looked up at the rapidly approaching shape, and right when he was certain he was about to get his answer to whether there was life after death, the creature flared its wings. It snapped to a halt mid-air, then dropped calmly into the sands, the impact throwing up a thick cloud of grit. Typical, O'Neill grunted. The gust snuffed out his cigarette, and his mouth filled with sand, as if the desert itself felt compelled to comment on his timing. The great beast flapped his wings once, scattering the dust cloud. What emerged was a 6-meter-tall figure draped in gold feathers, vast and composed in a way that bordered on regal. For a fleeting moment, O'Neill almost believed it. Then he saw the smile. It was not wide or savage. It was measured, thoughtful, and perhaps faintly sarcastic. The kind of expression that suggested a decision was being weighed, one that did not include entirely charitable options. O'Neill could not shake the feeling that his liver was somewhere on the feeding menu shortlist. Hello, Montes. How's the wives? The great beast said, his voice booming, edged with that distinctly unsettling note of mischief. Did he just ask about the general's wives? O'Neill asked dryly. Apparently so, Captain, Abel grunted. Montes took a moment before responding. Quite well, great beast. As for the gentlemen behind me, they are the Vulpina Rangers, here at your request, he said evenly. Ah, yes, the famous Vulpina Rangers. I have heard of you, the great beast said. O'Neill felt the urge to snark, but swallowed it. Staring a towering ancient had a way of humbling even the most irreverent soldier. From where exactly? Abel grunted. Perceptibly, every Vulpus in the area glanced at their general. Not exactly the diplomatic tone everyone was hoping for. From all of you, of course, I can hear you through my soldiers, the great beast said, gesturing toward a nearby hive creature, its arm ending in a worryingly oversized blade. Now then, on to business. He clapped his hands together. The sound carried enough force to shove the air aside, kicking up dust across the sand. No one commented. No one was foolish enough to. I know when you look at me, all of you struggle with, what's the word? He tilted his head slightly. Ah, yes. Trust. Why mortals do not trust someone like me is something I will likely never fully understand. Regardless, my offer is quite simple. Help me first, and I help you later. At that, the entire line of Vulpina Rangers seemed to stiffen at once. Brows furrowed. O'Neill could practically hear the same thought ripple through them. Did he just acknowledge that we do not trust him, and then ask us to trust him anyway? I am sure you are wondering why I would ask for trust, the great beast continued smoothly. Well, trust is overrated. He said it with absolute confidence, as if he had not just set fire to the fundamentals of diplomacy. To be fair, the Vulpus were not strangers to negotiations conducted this way, so it was not entirely shocking. That did not stop Montes from feeling his blood pressure rise. So I offer something far simpler, the great beast said with a grin. I do not let you all die. O'Neill heard Montes draw in a slow, measured breath as the words settled. Despite himself, he almost felt bad for the man. Almost. "So the fog is creeping," the great beast continued casually. "At this rate, you will all die out before long. I can get you across the mountains to better land, or whoever wants to go. Those with a death wish are free to stay behind. All I ask in return is that you help me find the world gate." Abel grunted. "Only problem is we can't stay in the fog for long. Our gear doesn't last." "That's not a problem." The great beast produced a strange creature, its body compact, with multiple grasping limbs curling and uncurling along its sides. It twitched slightly, as if eager. "This will keep you safe," he said. "I call it the face hugger." O'Neill could practically feel the unease ripple through the other ranger officers. First question, how was that thing supposed to help? Second question, face hugger? That did not sound nice, or safe, or like something anyone should voluntarily allow near their face. "I am not putting that on my face," one ranger replied bluntly. O'Neill could see the grin widen on the great beast's face. "Come on, don't be a baby. It's not going to lay eggs or anything." Chapter 260, The Lone Star. O'Neill glowered at the twitching thing in front of him. It was disgusting, insectoid. Thankfully, there was no mouth on the underside. In fact, there was no mouth at all. No eyes either. Just a repulsive cluster of limbs clearly designed for one purpose: grabbing onto his face. He looked up just in time to see General Abel sigh, step forward, and lift the creature toward himself. It latched on with a soft, unsettling click. Abel stumbled back half a step, brows knitting together, then steadied himself and turned to face O'Neill's stunned stare. "You know," Abel said after a moment, shrugging slightly, "it's not that bad. Can't say it's uncomfortable." What was worse, his voice was not muffled at all. Abel glanced at a nearby officer who was hesitating a bit too long. He sighed, reached out, and shoved the creature straight at the man's face. The bug latched on instantly. The officer yelped and flailed, hands scrabbling at the thing clamped to his snout. "Oh, calm down," Abel snorted. The officer froze, then gave a stiff nod, standing perfectly still as if movement alone might make the situation worse. Watching this, O'Neill sighed. He stepped forward and pressed the creature to his own face. It latched on immediately. To his surprise, it was comfortable. Disturbingly so. It did not restrict his breathing in the slightest, which was unsettling, given that O'Neill could not see a single air hole beneath the thing's body. It clung snugly, evenly, as if it had been tailored to his face. Stranger still, it did not feel hard or chitinous at all. The surface was soft, pliable, almost like fabric. That was the worst part. It looked like something that should be rigid, spiked, and actively attempting to burrow into his skull. Instead, it felt like a mildly warm scarf that had made some deeply questionable life choices. The sensation made his skin crawl in ways the desert never had. His brain kept insisting this was wrong, profoundly wrong, while his face stubbornly refused to suffocate or suffer in any meaningful way. He hated it. "See, not so bad, right?" the great beast said cheerfully. The response he received was a chorus of low, disgruntled grumbling from the assembled vulpes. Not screams, not protests. No one tried to run, which in hindsight was impressive. It was the sound of professional warriors reaching the same grim conclusion at once. First, this was happening. Second, it was happening right now. Lastly, fighting it would only make it worse. The noise rolled through the group like a shared sigh of resignation, punctuated by the occasional muttered curse and the unmistakable tone of people filing a mental complaint they knew would never be addressed. Faces remained stiff, bodies stayed still, pride was swallowed whole. It was not fear. Fear would have at least been energetic. This was the collective irritation of being forced into a deeply undignified situation by something powerful enough that objecting felt not just pointless, but futile in the worst way. "So how do these things work?" Abel asked. "Oh, they generate a field around you that blocks the ether fog," the great beast replied cheerfully. An awkward silence washed over the rangers, the kind that settled in when no one was quite sure which question to ask first, or whether asking any questions at all would make things worse. "So," Abel said at last, gesturing at the creature latched firmly to his muzzle, "why does it have to be on our face?" Aesthetics, the great beast said with absolute confidence. That answer landed poorly. Does it work if we put it on our arm? One ranger asked carefully, as if speaking too loudly might void whatever fragile safety they now possessed. No, the great beast replied without hesitation. I designed it, so it only functions when attached to the face. Another wave of grumbling rolled through the group. Louder this time, more pointed, the sound of people realizing that this was not an accident, not an oversight, but a deliberate design choice made by something that clearly enjoyed watching them endure and process it. O'Neill stared out at the desert, face wrapped in a creature that felt like an expensive scarf from hell, and wondered how exactly his life had reached a point where face-based fog immunity was something that existed. Abel sighed and glanced toward the distant wall of fog. Should we test them out? Another round of grumbling rolled through the ranks. You don't trust me? The great beast asked, his tone wounded in a way that was very obviously sarcastic. He doesn't trust anyone, O'Neill said helpfully. Not even himself. No offense. Without another word, Abel turned his mount and began riding toward the distant wall of fog, its pale edge curling and shifting like a living thing. Stay here, he called over his shoulder. Behind him the men shifted uneasily in their saddles. Leather creaked, a mount snorted, sensing what its rider did not like to think about. Ah, fuck, O'Neill muttered, tugging on the reins as his mount sidestepped before falling in line behind the general. I believe I ordered you to stay put, Abel said curtly, the clipped edge of command carrying easily across the open ground. If it doesn't work, O'Neill replied lightly, adjusting his seat as the sand crunched under hoof, someone has to drag you back. Love the vote of confidence, Captain, Abel grumbled. I could go in instead, you know, O'Neill said, glancing down at the creature clamped to his face. Test the thing out. Abel shook his head once. I appreciate the initiative, Captain, but as the commanding officer, I need to know how this works. Then tactically, we should go in together, O'Neill replied idly. Teams, you know. Really, Captain? The buddy system? Abel snorted. Seems a bit late to be revisiting basic training. First principles, sir, O'Neill said with a faint chuckle. No, Abel replied firm. You stay back. If something goes wrong, I need you ready to rush in and drag me out. That doesn't seem viable if you wander off alone, sir, O'Neill replied as they both paused in front of the fog wall. Up close, it was worse than it looked from a distance. The ether fog churned and coiled in on itself, thick and luminous, its edges breaking into slow, writhing tendrils that reached out before dissolving back into the mass. Faint crackles of energy rippled through it, like distant lightning trapped in mist. The air prickled against exposed skin, and O'Neill felt his eyes sting the moment he got too close. Yeah, well, by regulation I can't order you on a suicide mission, Abel grunted. To be fair, General, O'Neill replied, you wrote the regulations, you can unwrite them. Abel turned, reached out and poked O'Neill squarely on the forehead, giving his head a slight shove. And that, Abel growled, is exactly why you're a captain and not a general. I do that, and half the men desert. Abel let his hand fall and fixed O'Neill with a look that carried more fatigue than anger. O'Neill knew why he couldn't change it. It was obvious once you were in the business long enough. Regulations were not just words on paper. They were promises. Rules had to be stable, even for the men who wrote them, especially for the men who wrote them. The moment rules bent to convenience, they stopped being rules and became weapons. People needed to know the line would hold, that it applied today, tomorrow, and to everyone equally. If soldiers believed regulations only existed to be rewritten when it suited command, trust collapsed, discipline followed, and what remained was not an army, but a mob waiting for an excuse to fracture. Now stop yapping and keep watch. If not, I'm promoting you, Abel growled. O'Neill visibly recoiled. Yeah, that's what I thought. Pay attention. If I die, you wear the Lone Star. Abel grunted before turning and stalking off toward the fog. O'Neill watched as Abel approached the fog. The creature clamped to Abel's face shifted slightly, and the ether mist peeled away from him, forming a clean, perfect sphere of empty air. Abel looked around, then took a cautious step to the left. The fog parted again, obediently curling away from him. He stopped, planted his hands on his hips, and grunted. Then why, he asked flatly, Is it on my face? Back at Fort Rolve, O'Neill stalked between the tents, holding the facehugger out in front of him like a sacred relic, the thing twitching eagerly in his grip. Recruits scattered on instinct, boots kicking up sand as they tried and failed to look disciplined while fleeing. "Relax," O'Neill shouted cheerfully. "This little beauty will protect you from the fog. Just let it latch on." Several of them froze in place, eyes wide. "It'll be quick," he added helpfully. "Probably." One unfortunate recruit backed into a supply crate and squeaked when O'Neill lunged a step closer. "Don't fight it," O'Neill continued. "Fighting just makes it worse. Lay still, breathe normally, and try not to think about the eggs." "What eggs?" someone yelled. "Oh, you'll know," O'Neill said. "You'll all know." In the distance, a sergeant pretended very hard not to see any of this happening, and the camp filled with the sound of panicked obedience, nervous laughter, and the unmistakable lesson that survival in the Vulpina Ranges involved many things, not least of which was learning when your superiors were enjoying themselves a little too much. Then a scream cut through the camp. One of the recruits had snapped. With a sound somewhere between a battle cry and a nervous breakdown, he lunged forward and slapped the facehugger onto his own face. It latched instantly. There was a half-second of stunned silence. Then he started screaming. "Why does it feel like cloth?" he howled, clawing uselessly at it. "This is wrong. It should be hard, or sharp, or something. Why is it so soft?" O'Neill doubled over, laughing. "I know, right?" he shouted back. "That's the worst part." The recruit staggered in a tight circle, hands hovering near his face like he was afraid touching it too much might make it angry. "It's warm. It's breathing with me." "Stop panicking," O'Neill called. "You're fine. If it was going to kill you, it would have done it by now." That did not help. Eventually the recruit froze, shoulders slumping as the realization hit him. He stood there, stock still, face wrapped in a creature that felt like a cursed scarf, quietly reassessing every life decision that had led him to this moment. Then a voice boomed from the watchtower. "Captain O'Neill!" Every head snapped upward. "Stop hazing the recruits and get your sorry ass up here." The camp went dead silent. O'Neill slowly straightened, still holding the facehugger. He glanced around at the frozen recruits, one of whom was still standing rigid, face wrapped, breathing very carefully. "In my defense," O'Neill said loudly, "this is technically training." Abel's silhouette leaned over the railing. "Move. Now." O'Neill winced. "Right, yes, sir." He gently peeled the creature off the recruit's face. The thing resisted for half a second, then let go with a faint, disappointed twitch. "You did great," O'Neill told the shaken recruit solemnly. "Textbook acceptance phase." The recruit did not respond. He was staring into the middle distance, forever changed. O'Neill jogged toward the tower, passing a line of wide-eyed recruits who instinctively leaned away from him as he went. Behind him, someone whispered, Do we get one of those too?" Another voice replied softly, "I hope not." From the tower above, Abel sighed the long, tired sigh of a man who deeply regretted promoting competence over personality. When O'Neill re-entered the tower, he had the gall to look genuinely curious. "So," he asked, tilting his head slightly, "what's wrong?" Abel did not raise his voice. "Captain O'Neill," he said evenly, "stand at attention." The tone was calm, flat, worse than shouting. O'Neill straightened immediately, boots snapping together, back rigid, eyes forward. Every trace of humor vanished from his face. The ashtray struck him a heartbeat later. It clipped his shoulder and shattered against the wall behind him, fragments clattering across the floor. Abel did not even look at where it landed. "Explain," Abel said quietly, stepping closer, "why I am hearing screams in my fort." O'Neill swallowed once. "Sir, morale exercise." Abel stared at him for a long moment, expression unreadable. "Captain," he said at last, "if I hear that you have introduced the phrase 'lay eggs' to another recruit, I will personally ensure you spend the rest of this campaign cataloguing latrines." O'Neill did not blink. "Understood, sir." Abel turned and planted a finger on the map spread across the table. Several areas had been circled in thick ink, some overlapping, others connected by short, deliberate marks. "Here, here, and here," Abel said. O'Neill leaned in, expression sharpening. 4 days march to reach the general area. Abel continued evenly. 6 days minimum to search it properly. 4 days back, assuming nothing goes wrong. Then we reassess and try again if needed. Abel paused before he straightened. I'm not going. O'Neill glanced up. Sir? The bandits are still active, Abel said flatly. Someone has to hold the line and keep this camp from falling apart while you're gone. That's me. Abel fixed him with a steady look. You'll lead the expedition. O'Neill nodded once. No jokes this time. Pick 6 officers, Abel continued. Each of them heads a team. People you trust to operate independently, keep discipline, and not lose their heads when things get strange. A pause. This is a suicide mission if mishandled, Abel said. I want officers who understand that and don't need to be reminded. Yes, sir, O'Neill replied. Get your act together, Abel added. Prepare properly. Supplies, timelines, contingencies. This is not a stunt. O'Neill straightened. I'll have names within the hour. As he turned to leave, Abel spoke again, voice dry. And Captain? O'Neill stopped. Sir? If any of your officers die because you thought something was funny, Abel said calmly, I will promote you. O'Neill stiffened. That's right, Abel continued, voice dry and merciless. Paperwork, endless reports, meetings, stuck indoors while other people do the fighting. No dust, no gunfire, no field work. Just a star on your chest and a desk you can't escape. He looked up at O'Neill. You hear that, Captain? O'Neill swallowed. Yes, sir. Abel nodded once. Good, now move. Understood, sir. Chapter 2, 161. Into the fog. O'Neill stood within the fog, grumbling under his breath as he nudged a loose rock with his boot. The ether mist curled and parted around him in a perfect sphere, held back by the creature latched to his face. Beyond that boundary, the fog churned thick and luminous, swallowing distance and sound. His men fanned out in practiced arcs, boots soft against sand turned damp by condensed ether. Rifles up, eyes scanning. The howls drifting through the fog were distant, distorted, hard to place. The great beast's hive was doing a decent job holding the perimeter. Then something came hurtling out of the mist. A hive body slammed into the ground ahead of them and rolled, limbs flailing loosely before going still. It was missing half its torso. Whatever had hit it had crushed its armored plates into pulp. The impact so violent the chitin had folded inward like wet clay. O'Neill's fist shot up. His men froze mid-step, then dropped into crouched positions in a fluid motion. He glanced toward the anti-material rifle operator. The man had already gone prone, bipod digging into the sand, optic cutting through the fog as best it could. Then O'Neill felt it. A sudden wash of heat, sharp and searing, rolled across his exposed skin. A bright flare of light passed overhead, burning white through the mist. He looked up just in time to catch a glimpse of it. Wings wreathed in flame, a blazing silhouette cutting through the fog like a living comet. One of those phoenixes from Elysia. O'Neill tensed on instinct. At another time, without allies, this would have been a suicide mission. Marching blind through energized ether with predators lurking was not a plan. It was a death sentence. He motioned sharply for the team to shift right, angling away from the fight. Was he a coward? No. Was he scared? Of course he was. Visibility was barely 10 meters at best. The fog swallowed sound and depth alike. If something large decided to charge through that white curtain, he would have a heartbeat at most to react. Maybe less. Courage was not standing still and waiting to be crushed. Courage was moving before the thing that killed the hive soldier decided they were next. His team moved in silence. Then a shriek tore through the fog. For a brief, impossible moment, the mist ahead of them thinned and peeled away, dragged inward toward the source of the sound. O'Neill watched the fog around him drain as if caught in a great inhalation. And then he saw it. The phoenix had something pinned beneath its talons. The creature was enormous, grotesque, a mass of warped muscle and armored hide thrashing against the sand. The phoenix stood over it like an executioner, wings flared wide, every feather burning, searing indigo. The air itself bent toward the phoenix. Ether streamed into it, pulled from the fog in luminous currents. The mist collapsed inward as raw energy fed the creature, and its body blazed brighter and brighter until it looked less like flesh and more like a small star forced into a living shape. With a violent beat of its wings, the phoenix bodily lifted the screeching monster a meter off the ground. Then it slammed it back down. The impact shook the earth. Its talons, red-hot and glowing, punched through armored plates as if they were wax, melting straight through flesh and bone alike. The stench of vaporized matter filled the air. The heat rolled outward in a suffocating wave. O'Neill and his team flinched, eyes watering, barely able to keep them open as light and fire overwhelmed their vision. The sand beneath the phoenix fused and shimmered, turning to glass in widening ripples around the struggling beast. For a moment, the battlefield was nothing but shrieking monsters, burning light, and the sound of something very large, realizing it had miscalculated. Then the monster went still. The phoenix let out one final piercing shriek that seemed to vibrate through bone. It flared brighter for a heartbeat, then launched skyward in a burst of fire and ash. Almost immediately, the fog rolled back in. It did not hesitate. It did not retreat. It simply flowed back, thick and stubborn, reclaiming the space the phoenix had carved out. The glassed sand dimmed beneath the returning mist, and the world shrank once more to 10 meters of visibility and the sound of breathing. O'Neill exhaled slowly. For a fleeting second he had wondered if the hive, or something strong enough, could simply drink the fog dry. If enough force could clear it permanently. Apparently not. Even something as powerful as a phoenix could only siphon it briefly, drawing in the ether for a surge of strength before the mist flowed back into place. The fog was not prey, it was more like weather. Or terrain. You could no more kill it than you could kill the wind. You could shoot at the rain all day and never make it stop. The fog was the same. It did not fight back, it simply endured, which meant they would have to endure longer. "Move," O'Neill ordered quietly, "before the commotion draws something worse." A corporal hesitated, scanning the fog nervously. "It might have scared them off, sir." O'Neill gave a low grunt. "Fog beasts don't scare," he said flatly. "They charge." He had seen it enough times to know aggression was not a choice for things born in ether. It was baseline. Noise did not drive them away, it attracted them. "Keep moving," he added, already stepping forward. "Aye, sir." The rest of his squad echoed before following. They marched on for several more hours. Still no sign of the damned world gate. Statistically, the hive would probably find it first. There were simply more of them, and they did not tire the way men did. The rangers were not here to outpace the hive. They were here to guide it. O'Neill checked the old maps again, their edges worn thin from handling. Before the continent had shifted, before the forests had withered, and the air had turned venomous, this region had been temperate woodland, rivers, game trails, trade paths. Now it was desert, blanketed in ether-poisoned fog. Landmarks meant nothing anymore. What had once been valleys might now be dunes. What had been ridgelines might have sunk beneath sand. The gate, if it still stood, would not be where anyone remembered it. Then he saw a flare. Or rather, he saw the glow of it. The fog swallowed most things, but very bright light still bled through. A streak of green shimmered faintly above the mist. Green. Rally. O'Neill did not hesitate. He fired his own flare, another green arc vanishing into the ether. A moment later he caught the distant glow of a third flare further off. It was a simple system. When visibility was barely 10 meters, simplicity kept you alive. You moved toward the flare that fired first. You answered with your own so the next team could triangulate. When the oldest flare burned out, someone else fired again. The cycle repeated, light to light, signal to signal. That was how you got scattered squads to converge on the same point in a world that refused to be seen. Eventually, he reached the clearing. The fog thinned abruptly, pulled back in a wide 50-meter circle around a strange, towering construct at its center. The creature was grotesque and elegant all at once, its form bristling with vents and lattice like growths that pulsed faintly. Ether streamed into it in visible currents, the mist collapsing inward as if inhaled by an unseen lung. Beyond it, the expedition force was already gathering as dusk began to settle. Lanterns flickered to life in orderly rows, tents were going up with mechanical precision, crates were stacked, tools clanged. The hive moved in disciplined patterns, digging shallow holes in the ground where supplies were being offloaded. Above, faint streaks of light marked Elysian drops from the east, and within minutes those supplies were sorted, catalogued, and distributed without visible confusion. O'Neill scanned the scene, jaw tight. He hated to admit it, but it was efficient. "O'Neill," Wyatt's voice cut through the clearing. The fellow captain waved his hat over his head, boots crunching across the sand as he approached. O'Neill's squad trudged in behind him, shoulders heavy, weapons still up out of habit. "Lost anyone?" Wyatt asked, scanning their faces. "Nope," O'Neill replied. "You?" Wyatt shook his head. "No, and neither did anyone else." He glanced toward the perimeter where the hive forms moved with mechanical discipline. "Say what you want about them," Wyatt admitted, lowering his voice slightly. "They're good at what they do. No contact all day. Not a single beast got through." He let out a slow breath. "These things can fight." "Tell me about it," O'Neill grunted, saw one of those Elysian phoenixes cook an abomination like it was a slab of steak. Wyatt's brow lifted slightly. "Lifted the thing off the ground, slammed it back down," O'Neill continued, talons glowing red. "Melted straight through it. Turned half the sand around it to glass." Wyatt glanced instinctively toward the horizon, as if expecting to see scorched earth even now. "Right," he muttered. "Yeah," O'Neill said flatly. "Right." Wyatt rolled his shoulders and glanced back at the marked chart in his hands. "We checked the outer southern perimeter," he said. "Next, we move toward the central location, most likely spot, if we're where we think we are." He frowned at the inked lines. "And if the landmass didn't shift too much from the map." "Or if the map's accurate at all," O'Neill grunted. "Please don't jinx it," Wyatt muttered without looking up. O'Neill peeled the face-hugging creature from his muzzle with a faint, reluctant tug. It detached with a soft, almost offended twitch. He lit a cigarette and drew in slowly. "Hard to jinx a 300-year-old map, Wyatt," he said, smoke curling into the clearing. "It's either right or it isn't." "Right." Wyatt grimaced, then wordlessly accepted one of O'Neill's cigarettes. "Well, hopefully we don't have to start digging for the World Gate," O'Neill said. "The hive are better diggers than we are," Wyatt replied. "That's why I said hopefully," O'Neill muttered, exhaling a thin stream of smoke. "I respect their combat ability, but let's be honest. They don't exactly look reflective." Wyatt snorted. "They might stare at the gate for 5 minutes and decide it's just a particularly stubborn rock," O'Neill added. "They aren't that dumb, I hope," Wyatt muttered, blowing out another cloud of smoke as he rolled up his map. "Love the optimism, Wyatt," O'Neill said. "Come on, I'm starving." He flicked ash into the sand and started toward the supply tents, the fog humming faintly at the edge of the clearing as night settled in. O'Neill wandered toward the cook fires and found a nervous private hunched over a pot of stew that smelled suspiciously like actual nutrition. He leaned over and peered inside. Cubes of meat. Real meat. Vegetables that had not been dried to death. Broth thick enough to suggest someone, somewhere, had thought about seasoning. "Where'd you learn to cook this?" O'Neill grunted. "This is Elysian stock." "I didn't, sir," the private admitted quickly. "Just threw it all in with water." O'Neill stared into the pot another second, then straightened. "Well," he said, flicking ash from his cigarette, "hard to ruin it when they ship us food that actually wants to taste good." He stepped away, the smell following him, and made a mental note that fighting alongside people who glassed sand and sent proper rations was not the worst strategic development in the world. That night, the officers gathered, 6 of them, each commanding a 6-man team. All captains, all senior, all capable of stepping into General Abel's place if he fell. Abel had not sent juniors. That fact hung heavier than the desert air. If these 6 were here, it meant the rest of the wastes were thinner, less guarded. Fewer experienced hands holding fragile lines against bandits, beasts, and whatever else stirred beyond the fog. Everyone in that circle understood something unspoken. Abel did not make decisions like this lightly. "All right, listen up," O'Neill said, cigarette ember glowing faintly in the dim light. "Things are going well. We haven't found anything yet, but we set out with 80 men, and we still have 80 men." A few nods circled the fire. I count that as a win, given where we are. Low murmurs of agreement followed. No cheering, no bravado. Just the subdued acknowledgement of professionals who understood that in a place like this, survival was not the default outcome. O'Neill took another slow drag and exhaled. Tomorrow we push toward the central marker. Stay tight, stay disciplined. If something feels wrong, it probably is. The fire crackled softly as the fog pulsed faintly at the edge of the clearing. How's equipment? O'Neill asked. Any ether corrosion? The captains exchanged glances, then shook their heads. No issues, one replied. The facehuggers keeping the fog out also means our rifles aren't suddenly starting to glow. A few low chuckles rippled around the circle. Yeah, O'Neill muttered. Thought so. That's one headache gone. He tapped ash into the sand and looked around at the faces lit by firelight. One less variable trying to kill us. And he got a bunch of grumbles as an answer. O'Neill sighed as he took a swig of that fancy Elysian wine they call cognac. The briefing dragged on, but the night was fitful. The Elysian soldiers had insisted the Rangers rest while they took watch, but in classic Vulpes fashion, extra sentries were posted anyway. Trust was a luxury. Redundancy was survival. O'Neill found himself taking the last shift earlier than scheduled. He could not sleep. The fog hummed faintly beyond the clearing, and every distant sound felt like a promise of teeth. When he took over the watch, he grimaced and lit a cigarette, the small ember a stubborn defiance against the dark. One thought kept circling back. What if they could not find it? The world gate might be buried, destroyed, shifted somewhere no map remembered. Would the great beast simply shrug and move on? Would the offer of salvation quietly expire while the fog continued its slow, patient advance? O'Neill exhaled smoke into the thin air and stared into the darkness. He did not like unanswered contingencies. Technically, there was another path forward. The Vulpes could make themselves indispensable. O'Neill had seen the Elysians shoot. They were competent, professional even. But they could not hit a sandfly at 100 meters the way a ranger could. Rangers were snipers first. Everything else came after. For years, that had been the doctrine in the wastes. If a raider rode alone, you did not duel him. You did not chase him. You ended him. One shot. Just another body cooling in the sand. It kept the numbers down. It kept the chaos manageable. Only in recent years had that paradigm started to collapse. The raiders adapted. They began moving in groups, deliberately clustering to discourage isolated snipers. A lone ranger could pick one off, sure, but then the rest would scatter or worse, try to run him down. So the rangers adjusted in turn. Smaller patrols became larger ones. Ambush became engagement. Engagement became brawls. It was messier now, louder, bloodier, but the core skill never vanished. O'Neill took another drag and watched the ember flare. He grunted and let the thought roll round in his head. If only there were a place where rangers could prove their mettle in this kind of arena. Somewhere precision actually decided the outcome. Then again, he was not foolish enough to wish for it. A clean conflict where two sides settled things with disciplined sniping lines was a romantic fantasy. War did not work that way. You did not get polite distance and clear sight lines. You would need something absurd to force it. Some ridiculous terrain restriction. A giant crevice splitting the land in two. A massive river neither side could cross. A natural barrier that turned movement into suicide and left only marksmanship. O'Neill exhaled smoke into the night. Wishing for that kind of battlefield was stupid. Very stupid. Chapter 2, 162, Hidden Weapons. Corporal Tristan grumbled as he adjusted the unfamiliar weight of his new rifle. Some new design they were calling the needle gun. Why it was called that when it fired concentrated bolts of ether was beyond him, but the thing worked. Instead of a wide discharge, it released a narrow, high-powered beam of compressed ether. Thin and precise, built for penetration rather. Where older weapons blasted and flared, this one stabbed. Most of the design hinged on the optics. A new glass-like material, grown by the hive and fused into the rifle's housing, shaped and focused the discharge. The same material formed the scope mounted on top, a lens array that pulled distant shapes into startling clarity. Subtle enchantments woven into the glass enhanced contrast and granted a modest improvement in night vision. The only problem was the cartridges. The ether crystal loads did not last long. 10 shots, that was it. After that, you reloaded, just 10 precise chances before the ritual of swapping crystals and reseating the housing. The barrel was long, almost awkwardly so, built for stability and velocity, not convenience. In tight positions, it felt like trying to maneuver a spear through brush, but at least it came with a bipod. Tristan flipped the bipod down and let the legs bite into a nearby tree root. Crouched low, breathing slow and controlled, the length of the barrel finally made sense. The rifle settled into place as if it had always belonged there. Like him, it was buried beneath camouflage. Leaves woven through the frame, thin branches tied along the stock, a mottled cloak draped over his shoulders that, at a glance, passed for shrubbery. Subtle enchantments threaded through the fabric, bent light just enough to blur edges and soften movement. Not invisibility, just distortion, enough to make the eye hesitate. He scanned the opposing tree line. Across the river, the night pulsed with intermittent flashes. Red ether bolts streaked from his side in sharp, disciplined lines, cutting through the darkness. From the far bank came answering bursts of pale white, heavier discharges that flared briefly before vanishing into the canopy. The heavy ether bolters around him rattled in controlled bursts, spitting streams of red light across the water. Each impact lit the tree line in brief, violent flashes. From the elven side, the ballista answered. Great enchanted bolts arced over the river, trailing faint runic glows before slamming into earth or timber with thunderous cracks. When they struck, they did not simply pierce, they detonated, shards of splintered wood and ether scattering in bright, violent blooms. In the back of his mind, Tristan felt the absence of a spotter. Another set of eyes would have been useful, someone to confirm movement, to call corrections. Instead, he relied on the rifle. At the tip of the barrel, a thin windrod swayed subtly, responding to the air currents that curled along the riverbank. He adjusted slightly, barely a fraction, compensating for drift. His scope settled on an elven hunter too exposed, counting on shadow and distance to conceal him. Under normal circumstances, that might have been enough. The new optics cut through darkness cleanly. The enchantments sharpened outlines, separating body from bark, movement from stillness. But there was a problem. If he fired too precisely, too efficiently, the elves would know. The briefings had been explicit. Their night vision advantage was to remain concealed as long as possible. The surprise was worth more than a single clean kill. So Tristan waited. The hunter drew, loosed an arrow and shifted position. Tristan exhaled. He fired. The first shot went wide, deliberately off by enough to seem careless. The bolt struck bark several meters from the target, scattering splinters. A heartbeat later, he adjusted and fired again. The second bolt punched clean through the elf's upper torso. The hunter collapsed backward into shadow. Tristan kept the scope steady for a moment longer, then shifted his position slightly, reassessing the opposite bank. The correction had been minimal. The first round had gone where he told it to go. The second had gone exactly where it needed to. He could see the difference immediately. Past 150 meters, you compensated more by habit than by calculation. You aimed at an area and trusted probability to finish the job. The needle gun's discharge was narrower and more stable. The lens array kept the beam coherent over longer distances. He adjusted a fraction for wind, watching the thin rod at the barrel tip sway and settle. A flare of white caught his eye. An elven ballista discharged from deeper in the forest canopy, its enchanted bolt arcing out over the river. He tuned his scope and found it quickly. It was already taking sporadic fire from riflemen and heavy bolters on his side. Red ether discharges slammed into bark and timber, splintering trunks and sparking against the reinforced front shield mounted on the ballista's frame. The return fire was chaotic and suppressive, hoping something landed. Behind the ballista, partially obscured by branches, sat a container of enchanted bolts. He studied it briefly. Tactically, it was an obvious vulnerability. Ammunition clustered near artillery was always a risk. But the elves had little choice. The ballista was mounted high among the trees to gain elevation and angle over the river. Running ammunition from the forest floor would be slow, exposed, and inefficient under fire. So they accepted the danger. He adjusted his aim, removed the ammunition, and the ballista was useless. Even if the frame survived, he steadied the reticle on the container's edge. Wind minimal, distance stable, the needle gun's discharge cut through the scattered suppression fire, a narrow line of focused ether. The bolt struck the case cleanly. A heartbeat passed, then the ammunition ignited. The scope flared white as the contained enchantments detonated in sequence. He eased back slightly while the blast tore through the mounting platform. Timber splintered. The forward shield sheared loose. The ballista's frame collapsed into itself as fire ran through the branches. Tristan settled back into position and resumed scanning the tree line. It was tiring work, deliberately disguising precision. Every shot had to look incidental. Every correction had to appear imperfect. The illusion of randomness was as important as the kill. For now, though, the uncertainty worked in his favor, destroying the ammunition rather than the frame forced adjustment. They would have to store bolts further back, move them more cautiously, expose more runners, reposition more frequently. Even if they adapted, their artillery would lose freedom of movement, and in a stalemate across a river, restriction was leverage. Then Tristan ducked as shots starting landing nearby. Looks like he's been made. He let out a curse before hissing into his comms device and rolling into cover. Displacing. Callan grimaced as he knelt along the broad branch, boots wedged against bark worn smooth by years of use. Things were not looking good. They had not been good since the war began. He had lost 6 from his childhood circle already. 6 faces that had once shared meals, training bruises, late-night arguments about nothing. The group that had once filled a clearing with noise now fit into a single quiet memory. Individually, he knew the truth. Elf against Imperial, skill for skill, they held the advantage. Better reflexes, sharper senses, years more training before a human even learned to hold a blade properly. But war was not fought in duels. The Imperials had mass, depth, and reserves. They absorbed losses the way a river absorbed stones. A man fell and another stepped into place. Lines held because there was always another line behind it. The elves did not have that luxury. Their lives were long, and so was the road to adulthood. A warrior was not made in a single season. It took decades to refine the body, longer still to discipline the mind. A full century, sometimes more, before one was considered truly mature. Losing one was not a number, it was a century undone at the very least. The Imperials operated on a different scale. A human soldier could be trained in a year, not perfected, but competent and above all replaceable. The Empire's territory stretched wide, its cities dense with population. Every town could supply recruits. Every loss could be offset by another name entered into the rolls. Callan drew and loosed a shot from his bow at a spraying heavy gun across the river. The arrow struck the front shield with a sharp crack, doing little damage but forcing the gunners to react. The weapon paused for a fraction of a second before its barrel shifted and a stream of red ether bolts tore toward his vague position in the canopy. Callan was already moving. He vaulted higher into the branches, boots barely grazing bark before pushing off again. The upper canopy swallowed him as thick, enchanted leaves absorbed most of the incoming discharge, the bolts flaring and dispersing as they slammed into layered foliage. Lower branches splintered under the impact, but he was no longer there. The Imperials had mostly figured out by now that the canopy was excellent cover, and that was the elves' greatest advantage in this fight. Their agility allowed them to move through branches with speed and precision, shifting position after every shot and retreating deeper into layered cover. The Imperials, by contrast, were constrained to the forest floor and a handful of static perches hacked into the trees. They had range and volume of fire. The elves had height, mobility, and a forest that had been shaped to favor them long before the war began. Callan displaced again, bounding along the branches to a new position deeper in the canopy. He landed lightly, shifted his footing, and caught sight of an old friend settling onto a branch below him, already drawing and sighting in. Ether bolts slammed into the foliage around them, shredding leaves and splintering bark, but the elf held his aim steady. The Imperials were not always trying to hit something specific. Often they were simply trying to get lucky. It made a certain brutal sense. If you poured enough fire across the river, eventually something would connect. His friend loosed an arrow and it struck home. Callan had just drawn breath to call out praise when an ether bolt hit him square in the chest. The discharge punched clean through. A brief red flare, sparks, and the bolt exited his back in a spray of vaporized bark and blood. For a suspended instant, time seemed to thin. Callan saw his friend's eyes widen, confusion overtaking focus. The smell of burnt flesh and ionized air reached him a heartbeat later. Then the body tipped backward and fell from the branch. Callan moved before the thought formed. He dropped after him, firing his grappling hook into a higher limb as he descended. The line snapped taut, swinging him inward. He caught his friend halfway down, wrapping an arm around the limp form as momentum pulled them into a controlled arc. Ether bolts tore through the branches above, splintering wood where they had stood seconds earlier. Callan braced against the trunk, boots scraping bark, holding the cooling weight against him while the canopy shuddered under sustained fire. "Aileron! Aileron!" Callan hissed, lowering them against the trunk. He looked down. There was a clean fist-sized hole through Aileron's chest. The edges were blackened, cauterized by the ether discharge. Armor had not slowed it. It had passed straight through, neat and clinical, as if the body had simply made room for it. Aileron had always gotten up. He had laughed through concussions, cursed through cracked bones, insisted he was fine when he clearly was not. Callan waited for that now, for the familiar groan, the muttered complaint, the irritated shove that said, "I'm not dead yet." "Callan," a voice called from above. He looked up. Two of his compatriots clung to the higher branches, faces tight, bows half lowered as they took in the scene below. Their eyes dropped to the body in his arms. They did not speak. They did not need to. The pair exchanged a glance, then shook their heads slowly. A bolt cracked overhead. It missed them, but not by much. The discharge tore through leaves where they had been moments earlier, heat washing down through the canopy. Another shot punched sideways into a branch, splintering it into shards that rained past Callan's shoulders. The two above grimaced and dropped lower along the trunk, boots scraping bark as they shifted position. Another ether round sliced through the space they had just occupied, passing through empty air. "We need to go, Callan," one of them called down. He tightened his grip on Aileron's body, jaw set, about to snap something back. The bolt hit first. A red flash snapped through the rope above him. The grappling line parted instantly. For a split second, there was only weightlessness. Then gravity returned and Callan dropped. He had just enough time to twist his shoulder inward before he and the body crashed through the lower branches. Twigs and leaves shattered around him as he tore through the canopy, bark scraping across armor. He hit the undergrowth hard. Air left his lungs in a violent rush as he rolled into ferns and loose soil, Aileron's weight dragging him sideways. The canopy above erupted again with ether discharge, bolts punching through trees. Whether it had been luck or deliberate precision, he did not know, but he leaned toward luck. If the Imperials were truly accurate enough to sever a moving rope in the middle of an exchange like that, they would not have wasted the shot on cordage. They would have put it through his spine or his skull and ended the matter cleanly. He doubted the Imperials had meant to free him from the tree. They had simply been pouring fire into the canopy. This time it had found rope instead of flesh. He rolled onto his side in the undergrowth, dragging Aileron's body in close as another ether bolt tore through brush nearby, the air stinging with heat and the sharp tang of ionized leaves. Callan looked up through the fractured canopy and saw bolts streaking through the forest like red shooting stars, carving brief lines of heat across the darkness before vanishing into bark and leaf. Then he noticed a soft glow drifting between the branches, a light spirit. It floated hesitantly into view, faint and translucent, one of the lesser spirits bound to the forest itself. They were fragile things, tied to root and soil, unable to stray beyond the woodland's reach. In bitter irony, it was these creatures who suffered most in the war. They could not flee. They could not fight. They endured. The spirit hovered over Aileron's body, its glow dimming as if in quiet recognition. For a moment it lingered there, suspended above the fallen elf, before its light thinned and faded back into the forest. Callan's jaw tightened. He shifted and dragged Aileron behind thicker cover just as more ether bolts tore through the space he had occupied seconds earlier. Splinters and sparks rained down around him. The spirits meant well, but in a battlefield like this, even a gentle glow might as well be a beacon that read, "Shoot here." Callan exhaled slowly as he felt Eleron's body cooling against him, the warmth draining away with quiet finality. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a thought stirred that he had no right to entertain in the middle of a firefight. He wondered whether that old ally, hidden near the ancient wood, would deign to intervene. The figure had always been attuned to the spirits and to the land itself, able to coax light from roots and silence from wind. But he kept to himself, and for good reason. He was different. Different in a way that drew scrutiny and aggression. Heaven was on good terms with the elves in the best of times, but they would not be pleased to learn the elves were sheltering him. The angels did not tolerate deviations from their doctrine. Variation made them uneasy. Orthodoxy was order, and order was control. The elves understood that. Their alignment with heaven had always been more strategic than ideological. It offered protection, leverage, and legitimacy in a world increasingly dominated by power blocks. But their debt to that old ally ran deeper than any strategic alignment. Callan silently closed Eleron's eyes and got ready to scale to the canopy again to continue the fight. But in the back of his mind he wondered, how long before that old ally is forced to join the fray? The Avalonian Empire will not give up any time soon. Chapter 2, 163. A Path Forward. O'Neill looked up at the gate and blinked. It was awkwardly tall. Absurdly tall, really. He had expected a ruin, something half buried and tilted under centuries of shifting sand. Instead, it stood perfectly upright, clean and deliberate against the wasted landscape. More than that, it did not even seem properly anchored. It just sat there, on soft sand, as if the world had shifted around it and it had declined to notice. He had half expected to find a slanted corner jutting out of the dunes, something they would need to excavate slowly and heroically through fog and sand. Camps set up, ropes, pulleys, a proper ordeal. Instead, the thing looked like it had been waiting for them, intact and indifferent. It was almost disappointing. "Well, this aged surprisingly well," O'Neill muttered dryly, craning his neck as he took in the towering structure. Behind him came a series of non-committal murmurs and low grunts. No one sounded impressed. No one sounded relieved either. Just the subdued acknowledgement of men who had braced themselves for weeks of excavation and instead found something that looked almost maintained. One of the captains spat into the sand. "Was expecting more rubble." "Was expecting it to fight us," another added. O'Neill exhaled slowly, eyes still on the gate. "Yeah, me too." "How exactly is a gate supposed to fight us?" one private asked, squinting up at the towering structure. "Don't know," another replied with a shrug. "Evil lightning or something." The first private snorted. "Yeah, sure. Lightning that eats babies coming out of an old building." A few of the rangers let out faint, tired laughs. Even O'Neill's mouth twitched slightly. Given everything they had already seen, though, none of them would have been particularly shocked if the thing had decided to spit fire or summon something unpleasant the moment they stepped too close. "All right, that's enough, call it in," O'Neill said before one of his privates shot a green flare into the sky, signaling to gather. A few hours later, the camp had settled into a rough perimeter around the gate, the fog held back in a wide circle by the humming creatures that siphoned ether from the air. Without the mist pressing in, the space felt unfamiliar, as though the land itself had shifted posture. "You know," a private murmured, eyeing one of the fog-draining creatures, "why doesn't the great beast just use these things to hold the fog back everywhere?" O'Neill took a slow drag from his cigarette before answering. "Private, we're rationing dried meat and roots back home. Half the wastes can barely feed themselves." He tapped ash into the sand. "You think we're in a position to support a herd of giant ether-eating monstrosities?" The private grimaced. O'Neill glanced at the creature again, watching the steady current of fog stream into it. "Whatever those things run on, I'm willing to bet it isn't cheap, and we're fresh out of surplus." Then a large shape descended from the clouds and landed heavily in the sand beyond the perimeter. O'Neill did not need to look twice. The great beast touched down cleanly for himself and kicked up a rolling wave of sand for everyone else. Grit-filled mouths, stung eyes, and rattled against armor as the gust swept through the camp. O'Neill looked down at the darkened end of his cigarette. "Of course," he muttered. He shook sand from his coat, cupped a hand around the lighter, and reignited it with deliberate patience, while the last of the dust settled. Around him, men coughed and wiped their faces as the towering figure straightened, wings folding back with slow, deliberate control. O'Neill exhaled smoke and glanced up at the great beast. "Good landing," he said dryly. "Naturally," the great beast replied, flashing a grin. "Wouldn't want to get sand on me." The smile was almost polite, which somehow made it worse. O'Neill felt a brief, unhelpful urge to throw something at him, a rock perhaps, or the lighter in his hand. The impulse lasted less than a second before the older, colder part of his mind intervened. Antagonizing a 6-meter-tall, gold-feathered predator with visible fangs was rarely productive. He settled for another drag of his cigarette instead and exhaled to the side. "Right," he muttered. "Heaven forbid." "Now then," the great beast said, dusting sand from his feathers with unnecessary precision, "I found this on a cliff off the coast." He extended one clawed hand, and with a faint distortion in the air, a stack of scrolls appeared. They did not fall so much as settle into existence, parchment bound in leather and marked with seals long cracked by time. O'Neill stared at them. "Found," he repeated carefully. "Yes," the great beast replied with mild satisfaction. "Cliff. Very scenic, terrible storage solution." The scrolls hovered for a moment before dropping into the sand with soft thuds. The parchment looked old, not ruined, preserved somehow, despite centuries of exposure. O'Neill flicked ash from his cigarette and stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "And this wouldn't happen to be related to the thing we've been walking through ether fog for weeks to find?" The great beast's grin widened just enough to be suspicious. "Oh, I wouldn't say it's completely related." "You ever wonder what Vulpina Maxima was like before the fall?" the great beast asked, tapping one claw lightly against the topmost scroll. "Heard stories," O'Neill grunted. "Forests so dense you could walk for days without seeing the sky. Rivers that did not poison you. Game that did not bite back with ether rot." "Well," the great beast said, nudging the scrolls forward with deliberate care, "these might give some context." The parchment shifted in the sand, old ink faintly visible along the edges. Whatever had been written there had survived quite a bit of time. O'Neill looked from the scrolls to the towering gate behind them, then back to the great beast. "Context," he repeated, smoke curling upward between them. O'Neill picked up the scroll and narrowed his eyes as he began to read. The script was Old Vulpus, the kind that predated the easy drawl and rough phrasing people used now. Back then, the language had been tighter, almost mechanical. Sentences came out in measured symmetry, similar lengths, clipped and economical. It read less like conversation and more like engineering documentation. Precise, efficient, and frankly terribly dull. He turned the parchment slightly, squinting through the weathered ink. The heading mentioned a project designation: Skyfall. The rest of the text was structured like a field report, the tone clinical and restrained, even as the implications crept in. "To the Council of Wardens, construction of the Skyfall apparatus is complete, and structural alignment holds within tolerance. The ether conduction lattice remains stable, and the focusing arrays have been calibrated. The platform is prepared for activation pending command authorization. However, the system remains untested and cannot be safely trialed. Any activation will produce an ether signature visible across the continent. Such a test would reveal both the existence and location of the platform. Therefore, no preliminary trial is recommended by the engineering body. The first activation must serve as both demonstration and engagement. When the order is given, the weapon will fire. All current calculations indicate the discharge will exceed previous ether events. The designated target will not survive the strike. Collateral effects beyond the target zone remain uncertain. Collateral effects beyond the target zone remain uncertain. O'Neill read aloud under his breath. He lowered the scroll and slowly looked around. Fog rolled across the wasteland in pale currents. The sand stretched out in every direction, broken only by jagged stone and the occasional dead stump of something that had once been a tree. Vulpina Maxima had been a forest once, a continent of green if the old stories were to be believed. Now it was this. O'Neill exhaled a thin stream of smoke and flicked ash into the sand. Well, O'Neill muttered, folding the parchment slightly between his fingers. Suppose that answers that. Interesting, right? Skyfall, the great beast said with a pleased grin, clearly enjoying himself. Imagine what we could do if we recover the wreckage. Imagine what we could learn. O'Neill glanced out across the fog-shrouded wasteland, then back at the scroll in his hand. Rather not, he grunted. Judging by what this place I call home turned into, I'd prefer if we never made any more skies fall. No fun, the great beast replied with a grin that suggested he meant the opposite. O'Neill said nothing. He took another slow drag from his cigarette, exhaled toward the sand, and reached down to pick up the next scroll. O'Neill unrolled the next scroll and immediately frowned. This one was in worse condition than the first. The parchment was brittle and darkened along one edge, half the text scorched away, as if someone had tried to destroy it in a hurry and failed. Large sections were missing entirely, leaving only fragments of sentences and jagged interruptions where the fire had eaten through the ink. What remained was still readable. The tone was different from the earlier report. Less measured and certain. Confirmation now received from the Western observatories. The Limbus catalyst has failed containment. Previous assurances from the angelic envoys regarding safe ether amplification were inaccurate. The ether overcharge has propagated outward as an uncontrolled radiation wave. Initial models underestimated the scale of dispersion. The forest canopy is already showing signs of collapse. Root systems are failing. Wildlife displacement is accelerating. Ether saturation is rising beyond sustainable thresholds. The damage will not manifest immediately in full, but the process has begun. Over the coming years, the forest will die. The land will lose its ability to sustain natural growth. What follows will not be recovery, but degradation. We believe the region will eventually become... The rest of the sentence had burned away. O'Neill stared at the blackened edge of the parchment for a moment before slowly lowering the scroll. The fog rolled across the desert beyond the camp, thick and endless, swallowing the horizon. Well, he muttered quietly, there's the rest of the story. Limbus catalyst, the great beast said, his voice carrying a note of genuine interest now, the sarcasm mostly gone. Interesting, no? It's probably destroyed, O'Neill grunted. Oh, of that I have no doubt, the great beast replied as he leaned down slightly, looming over the campfire's light. But my question, and what your question should be, is this. He tapped one claw against the charred edge of the scroll. Do they have more? O'Neill did not answer immediately. He just glanced up at the towering creature, cigarette still hanging from the corner of his mouth, smoke curling upward between them. The silence stretched for a moment while the wind pushed fog along the edges of the clearing. That was a far more uncomfortable question. You thinking of fighting the angels? O'Neill asked at last. That's not up to me, the great beast replied with a grin. The words suggested constraint, as if the matter lay outside his authority. The tone suggested something else entirely. There was something in his voice now, the kind that surfaced when predators noticed the possibility of a worthy hunt. For someone claiming the decision was not his, the great beast looked suspiciously pleased by the idea. And besides, the great beast continued with that same unsettling grin, I'm no warmonger. I don't throw my allies under the bus. I'm not nearly so short-sighted. I have no need for corpses. He straightened slightly, folding his wings with a slow rustle of feathers as the campfire light flickered across gold plumage. But the angels, he added lightly. Oh, who can say? O'Neill took a slow drag from his cigarette and watched the ember glow before dimming again. He did not answer. The thought sat in the back of his mind longer than he liked. He didn't like that he didn't fully disagree with the statement. What do you want, creature? O'Neill asked after a pause. Allies, of course, the great beast replied. Bullshit. You need us to be useful, O'Neill grunted, calling him out without ceremony. The remark hung in the air for a moment, and to his mild surprise, the great beast actually paused. You confuse me, Vulpus, the great beast said at last. I was under the impression that allies must be useful to be called allies. If not, it is not an alliance. It is charity. O'Neill took another drag and exhaled slowly into the desert air. He didn't like how he couldn't disagree with that either. So what now? We held up our part of the deal. Took us 4 weeks to find it thanks to our maps and reverse intel gathering. My wager is that if you just did a manual sweep, it would take you years. O'Neill said pointedly. The great beast nodded. Yes, you were certainly helpful. Dull as chasing through fog is, your maps and knowledge of the land proved efficient. Your tracking abilities are impressive. I did not need to babysit you nearly as much as I expected. You are highly capable scouts. The great beast admitted without hesitation. Praise was not something he expected from a creature like that. The admission had come too easily and directly. No sarcasm, no trick hidden in the phrasing. Just a blunt acknowledgement of competence. That alone was unsettling. Most powerful things he had met in his life preferred to remind you of how small you were. Raiders did it with threats. Sand barons did it with titles. Even senior officers sometimes did it with that quiet tone that said they were doing you a favor by noticing you existed. The great beast had simply said, you were useful. O'Neill wasn't sure if that was better or worse. He exhaled slowly, smoke drifting sideways in the desert air as he studied the massive creature standing across the campfire. Being complimented by something that could tear a fortress apart with its bare hands did not feel like praise. It felt more like a field report. So, O'Neill said, flicking ash into the sand, now that we've proven we're not completely useless, what happens to the rest of my people? The great beast's grin returned, sharp and amused in the firelight. Well, it said lightly, now comes the interesting part. You want to go on a tour of the Empire? Chapter 264, Vacation. Why the hell does only O'Neill and Wyatt get to go on vacation? One officer asked, arms crossed. 'Cause the general likes me, O'Neill said cheekily. He had just enough time to duck as Abel hurled a helmet at his head. Can it? Abel snapped. We are not going on vacation. We are going into foreign territory with no way back on our own. The officers quieted slightly, though the grumbling did not stop. O'Neill is coming because, insolent shithead that he is, he has an eye for schemes, Abel continued. Wyatt is going because he is more level-headed than all of you combined. And I'm going because I'm the commanding officer. That earned another round of muttering. Abel's gaze hardened. I need all of you to stop acting like children and make sure we still have a population to evacuate. Got it? The response came back uneven and reluctant. Aye, sir. Abel growled softly as he paused to think about it. On paper, it did not make much sense for the Empire to betray them once they arrived. There were only a few officers. The Rangers would not collapse without them. Disrupted, yes. Slowed, perhaps, but not broken. If the Empire wanted the Vulpes as allies, killing their envoys would be a poor opening move. It would also be a pointless one. Betraying them would gain the Empire almost nothing. The Rangers would not simply disappear because some officers and NCOs failed to return. If anything, the opposite would happen. The Vulpes were not the forgiving sort. News that their envoys had been murdered under a flag of negotiation would travel quickly across the wastes, and every Ranger still breathing would take it as proof that the Empire could not be trusted. Abel had spent his life watching how alliances formed and how they died. Fear could force obedience for a while, but trust built cooperation. If the Empire wanted scouts, guides, and soldiers who actually knew how to survive, then keeping their word was the simplest way to secure it. Still, the other side of the calculation refused to disappear entirely. Powerful states sometimes made decisions that looked foolish to outsiders. Empires occasionally removed inconvenient witnesses or decided that absorbing a territory was easier than negotiating with it. If the Empire believed the Vulpes were weak enough to be conquered later, then the lives of 3 major officers might mean very little in the grand arithmetic of expansion. Abel exhaled slowly through his nose. In the end, the logic pointed one way. Betrayal would create enemies. Keeping their word would create allies. One of those options cost nothing and gained useful partners. The other bought a war in the middle of a wasteland already trying to kill everyone in it. He suspected the Empire understood that difference. He just hoped they understood it as clearly as he did. O'Neill, come here, Abel barked. O'Neill sauntered over, hands in his pockets, cigarette still dangling from the corner of his mouth. He barely had time to open it before Abel grabbed him by the lapels and hauled him forward. Abel leaned in close and hissed into his face. "When we are over there, I don't doubt you will not do something stupid. What concerns me is you making a fool of yourself, and, by extension, us. Or getting drunk and getting into one of your famous bar fights." O'Neill blinked slowly as smoke drifted between them. "When we are there," Abel continued in a low growl, "you will be on your best behavior. You will not insult anyone important, you will not start fights, and you will not break anything." Abel gave his coat a small shake for emphasis. "Am I clear?" Before O'Neill could answer, Abel released him and turned to the rest of the men who had been chosen for the trip. 6 soldiers stood there with Wyatt among them, all watching with the uneasy patience of people who suspected they were about to receive a lecture. Abel stepped up to the first man and jabbed a finger into his chest. "No fighting." He moved to the next one. "No fucking fighting." Another step down the line, another pointed finger. "No fighting." He repeated it again and again as he walked past them, each soldier receiving the same warning, delivered with the same growing irritation. "No fighting." By the time he finished the line, the men were standing a little straighter, expressions carefully neutral. Abel folded his arms and glared at the group. "I am not joking. We are guests in someone else's territory. That means you keep your tempers, your mouths, and your hands to yourselves." Behind the smoke of his cigarette, O'Neill muttered quietly, "This is already sounding less like a vacation." Abel did not even look at him. He was already in full lecture mode. "That means no stealing," he continued, pacing slowly in front of the group. "No doing weird drugs you find lying about. No shit flirting that looks like harassment. No shacking up with random local women." He jabbed a finger toward the ground for emphasis. "You keep your hands where they belong and your pants on." Abel stopped pacing, turned back toward the group and bellowed, "Am I clear?" The response came back quickly this time. "Yes, sir." Abel stood there for a moment, chest rising as he took a slow breath, the kind a man took when deciding not to throttle half the people in front of him. A private appeared at his elbow as if summoned by instinct alone, holding out a glass of Avalonian brandy. Abel took it without a word. "Get the fuck out of my sight, all of you," he growled, "and get ready. We leave in 2 hours." The officers and soldiers scattered with suspicious speed. Abel took a slow sip of the brandy, cleared his throat, and stalked off toward his tent. O'Neill watched General Abel disappear into the camp and then glanced over at Wyatt. "They have weird drugs?" Wyatt closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his snout. "O'Neill, please just don't." "What? I'm just curious," O'Neill replied. Wyatt immediately jabbed a finger into his chest. "And that is exactly the problem." All right, no drugs, no drunken brawls, no local women," O'Neill said, and Wyatt just shook his head in response. A few hours later, O'Neill found himself climbing into a carriage, waiting deep underground. The tunnel had clearly been carved by the hive, a straight engineered passage that ran toward the Empire. Efficient, direct, and unsettlingly smooth for something that had probably been dug by creatures with claws. The first thing O'Neill noticed was how plush the interior was. Soft seats, proper lighting, even the faint smell of polished wood instead of dust and sand. It was far more comfortable than anything he had ridden in. Then he noticed the cooler. It was built neatly into the side of the carriage and packed with ice and bottles of chilled drinks. O'Neill immediately helped himself to one. He had always been a firm believer that fate helped those who helped themselves. "Wow, these Imperials really know how to live it up, huh?" O'Neill said as he took a large swig of the ice-cold beer. Abel just grunted as he pulled the brim of his hat down over his eyes and leaned back in his seat like he was about to take a nap. "Wyatt, you have first watch," Abel muttered. O'Neill glanced over at Wyatt, who simply nodded without complaint. "You're just going to sleep, General?" O'Neill asked, a smirk creeping into his voice. "Wipe that smirk off your face, O'Neill. I can hear it," Abel replied without opening his eyes. "Besides, in this box and underground, if the hive decides to kill us, we're dead anyway." O'Neill took another drink and leaned back. "Comforting." Wyatt frowned slightly. "Then why am I on watch?" "Principle," Abel grunted. The journey took a few days, and in O'Neill's opinion, it was maddening. The carriage was comfortable, the drinks were cold, and the route was efficient. But there were limits to what a man could tolerate. He had not expected that one of those limits would be taking a shit in a dim tunnel while a hive creature stood a few paces away, watching him to make sure he did not wander off. Turns out he was a shy pooper. You learn something about yourself every now and then, it seemed. When they finally reached their destination, O'Neill had to admit, if only to himself, that he was impressed. The floors were smooth and polished, the air was clean, and there was even a servant waiting with a tray of cold drinks the moment they stepped out into what looked like an underground reception hall. It was all very put together. He took the offered drink without hesitation. There were people everywhere, humans mostly, not soldiers either, workers, attendants, civilians going about their business. That caught his attention more than anything else. They were staring, not subtly either. Eyes followed the group openly as they moved through the hall. O'Neill could not blame them. Vulpus did not exactly blend in. Fur, ears, tails. Everything about them stood out against the mostly hairless humans around them. He doubted anyone here had seen a Vulpus in centuries, if ever. O'Neill took in the space and the people moving through it, and he couldn't help but wonder what life here would look like for the average Vulpus. Clean air, stable ground, food that did not try to kill you. The thought lingered longer than he expected. Almost without thinking, he slipped a cigarette between his teeth. Wyatt immediately reached over and snatched it out of his mouth. For a brief, feral second, O'Neill's instincts flared and he almost bit the hand on reflex before catching himself. "Not here," Wyatt hissed under his breath. "You know the humans don't like the smell." "Right," O'Neill grumbled, tucking the cigarette away. A pair of attendants approached soon after, bowing slightly before gesturing for them to follow. The group moved through a series of corridors, each as clean and orderly as the last. The lighting was steady and even, coming from faintly glowing fixtures set into the walls. No smoke, no flicker, just controlled illumination that made the whole place feel deliberate. They were led to another carriage, this one set along a rail that angled upward. O'Neill stepped in and took a seat by the window without being told. If they were finally heading to the surface, he wanted to see it. The carriage began to move, smooth and quiet, the motion steady as it climbed. There was no jolt, no rattling. Just a low hum that suggested whatever powered it was working properly. Natural light spilled in as they emerged from the tunnel, and O'Neill leaned slightly toward the window, eyes narrowing as the capital of Avalon came into view. The first thing he noticed was how clean everything was. The roads were properly paved, not packed dirt or cracked stone. Edges were straight, surfaces maintained. There was no debris collecting in corners, no wind-blown sand piling up where no one bothered to clear it. The streets were busy but orderly. People moved with purpose, but without tension. No one was scanning rooftops or keeping a hand near a weapon. Conversations happened openly. There was even the occasional laugh. They looked at ease, safe and content, bordering on complacency, at least to him. O'Neill's gaze moved across the details as the carriage rolled forward. Magic was present everywhere, but it was woven into the city rather than standing apart from it. Street lamps glowed with a steady light that did not flicker. Shop signs carried faint enchantments that made their lettering clearer and easier to read. Even something as simple as a door handle carried small etched runes, likely for durability or convenience. Further down the road, he spotted a maintenance crew working on a lamppost. One of them held a tool that gave off a faint hum. He pressed it against the base of the post, and a ripple of light ran through the structure, the glow stabilizing almost immediately. No dismantling, no scaffolding, just a quick adjustment before they moved on to the next one. O'Neill watched them for a moment, then leaned back slightly. "Efficient," he muttered. The carriage continued deeper into the city, past more of the same quiet order. No shouting, no scrambling, no sense that anything here was about to fall apart if someone stopped paying attention. It was an unfamiliar feeling. For once, O'Neill was in a place that did not seem like it was trying to kill him. "So the Empress will be meeting us then," Abel grunted as he adjusted his hat. O'Neill glanced at him and couldn't help the dry thought that followed. Abel's idea of cleaning up before leaving for Avalon had consisted of putting on slightly newer clothes and dunking that wide-brimmed hat into a bucket of water that had turned noticeably murkier the moment it made contact. The man stared at it for a second, nodded like the job was done, and put it back on his head. It looked like a lot of effort just to meet a monarch. O'Neill had not bothered. He had watched the entire process, taken a slow drag from his cigarette, and decided it was a waste of time. If the Empress wanted to see the Vulpus, she could see them as they were, not dressed up like something they weren't. His own hat had not been cleaned in 6 years, and it was going to stay that way. When they reached the palace, the group slowed without needing to be told. It was less a residence and more a fortress that had been dressed up to look presentable. Thick walls, clean lines, and layers of visible security that did not bother hiding themselves. O'Neill's eyes moved upward first. Phoenixes were perched along the upper spires, each resting on reinforced platforms that looked deliberately overbuilt to hold their weight. Even at rest, they radiated heat and presence, feathers faintly glowing against the sky. Below, royal guards stood at intervals along the approach. Their armor was massive, closer to constructs than equipment, the same kind of towering frames he had seen before on the wardens. They did not shift or fidget. They simply stood, each one a statement that getting past them would not be easy. Mixed among them were hive creatures. They stood like statues, unmoving and silent, their forms too alien to belong in any civilized setting, clawed limbs folded in, heads angled slightly as if observing everything at once. They did not react to the flow of people moving past them. What caught O'Neill off guard was the people. No one stared, no one hurried. Citizens walked past these things like they were just another part of the street. No flinching, no wide eyes, just quiet acceptance. O'Neill frowned slightly as he took it in. Either these people were very well protected, or they had gotten used to living next to things that could kill them without effort. When he walked into Palace, he couldn't help but whistle as he looked up at magnificent decor. Red carpet, banners taller than buildings, gold, silver, more silver. "This Empress Cecilia sure knows how to live it up," O'Neill said. "That's one way to put it." Aval grunted as he looked around as well. O'Neill's attention drifted from the guards to a group of noble ladies passing along the palace approach, and he found himself frowning for an entirely different reason. Their clothes looked utterly impractical, feathered accents that served no purpose beyond display, narrow waists cinched tight, open backs that left skin exposed, high slits that suggested movement but were paired with long trailing lengths of fabric that dragged along the polished stone. The garments flowed and shifted with every step, elegant in a way that made no sense to him. He watched one of them carefully step to avoid catching the hem under her own foot. "Right," he muttered under his breath. Back home, clothes were made to survive. Dust, heat, blood, whatever the day decided to throw at you. If something dragged on the ground, it got torn off or caught on something that wanted you dead. Here, it seemed the opposite applied. The more impractical it was, the more important it looked. And when the ladies spotted the grimy group, they all moved almost in unison. Feathered fans snapped open, covering the lower halves of their faces as they leaned slightly toward one another, whispering in low, careful tones. Their eyes, however, gave them away. They glittered with curiosity, tracking the Vulpus openly now that the pretense of discretion was in place. The fans hid their mouths, but not their interest. O'Neill glanced down at himself, then at Abel, then at Wyatt. Dust, scars, travel-worn gear that had seen better decades. Then, as they ventured deeper into the palace grounds, the crowd shifted. The nobles thinned out, replaced by men who carried themselves differently. Military types, high collars, heavy capes draped over broad shoulders, uniforms cut sharp and deliberate. Many bore scars across their faces, old lines that had long since healed but not faded. Their expressions were hard, measured, the kind that did not waste movement or attention. O'Neill felt himself relax slightly. These were his kind of people. As they passed, his gaze met that of an older officer standing off to the side. The man's posture was straight, eyes sharp. The kind of look that weighed and assessed in a heartbeat. No hostility, no curiosity, just recognition. O'Neill tipped the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. The officer gave a small nod in return, equally restrained, equally respectful. Seemed soldiers knew soldiers, no matter the land. When they got to the throne room, they saw the massive gold gate carved onto it was the symbol of the Empire. A great phoenix rising from the ashes and shrieking at the sky wings held out. Rather dramatic, O'Neill quipped, and Wyatt just gave a slightly committal grunt. Then the doors opened. As the group approached, O'Neill saw her, Empress Cecilia, and if he was being honest, he had no idea if she counted as pretty. Humans always looked strange to Vulpus, especially their women. No visible ears, expressions that felt harder to read, like something was missing from the face. But this woman did not come across as blank, not even close. She sat on the throne with one leg crossed, posture composed without looking stiff. One arm rested along the armrest, the other lightly supporting her cheek. It was not a deliberate pose so much as a settled one, like she had always been meant to sit there. Her chin was slightly raised, her gaze angled downward over the hall, taking in everything without settling on any one person. Her expression did not change. Her eyes were red, the color of polished rubies. Not warm, not inviting. They felt distant, like looking through crimson glass at something that had already decided what it was seeing. O'Neill held her gaze for a fraction longer than necessary, then looked away. He didn't like the feeling that came with it. Then she spoke, her voice light and airy, carrying easily through the chamber. "Welcome, Vulpus, to my empire.